Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the extraordinary library and collections in London of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Today's lecture is entitled The RIBA Refugee Committee, Architects in Exile, 1933 to 1939. This is a fascinating topic that addresses a lesser-known part of architectural history in the interwar years, the role of the RIBA in assisting architects fleeing the spread of fascism throughout Europe. Our speakers today are both great friends of the Trust. The lecture will be presented by Valeria Carullo. Valeria is the photographs curator at the Royal Institute of British Architects. Her principal area of research is the relationship between modern architecture and modern photography in the interwar years. Valeria writes and lectures regularly on both architecture and photography, and is the author of Moholy-Nagy in Britain, 1935 to 1937. She has also curated multiple exhibitions, both in Britain and internationally, including Wide Angle View, Architecture as Social Space, on the Architectural Review's Man Plane series of 1969 and 70. Beyond Bauhaus, Modernism in Britain, 1933 to 1966. Eternal City, Rome and the Photographs collection of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and Rationalism on Set, Glamour and Modernity in 1930s Italian Cinema. Our interlocutor for today's lecture is the noted architectural historian and curator, Barry Bergdahl, who's a specialist in the history of modern architecture. Barry is Meyer Shapiro Professor of Art History at Columbia University, where he's been a member of the faculty for over 3 decades. He served from 2007 to 2014 as Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he curated multiple exhibitions, including Mies in Berlin, Bauhaus 1919 to 1933, Workshops for Modernity, Rising Currents, Projects for New York's Waterfront, Henri Labrousse, Structure Brought to Light, Latin American Construction, Architecture 1955 to 1980, and Frank Lloyd Wright at 150, Unpacking the Archive. Barry has also organized exhibitions at the Musée d'Orsay, the Caisse des Monuments Historiques, the Centre Canadien d'Architecture in Montreal, the Banamex Cultural Center in Mexico City, and the Center for Architecture in New York. He's the author of multiple publications accompanying his exhibitions: the widely used textbook European Architecture, 1750 to 1890, in the Oxford History of Art series, and monographs on Carl Friedrich Schinkel, Mies van der Rohe, Léon Vaudier, and his editor, Marcel Breuer. He has lectured and taught in institutions around the world and serves on the jury of the Pritzker Prize in Architecture. Barry also serves on the Trust Advisory Council of the British Architectural Library Trust. Barry is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects and of the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects. Following Valeria's lecture, Barry will join her for further conversation. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Valeria Carullo.
Thank you very much, Ted. Thank you again, Ted. So I hope you can all see my the screen that I'm sharing. In this talk, obviously, I'm going to focus about the late 1930s, but I need to start from 1933, the crucial, turning point in this narrative, which is when Hitler and the Nazis went to power in Germany. Almost immediately, discrimination and persecution started of certain group of the population. Initially, it was political opponents and those of Jewish origin, and then increasingly anyone who was not considered an Aryan or heterosexual or in line with the party's politics and views. People started losing their positions, losing their jobs, their access to education, the possibility to provide for themselves and for their families. Many felt that, therefore, that they could no longer stay in Germany and decided or tried to emigrate. And let's not forget that this was not an easy choice. It was a very difficult choice. They were leaving their homes, their culture, their friends, sometimes their families. Basically, they were leaving everything that was familiar to them behind. Britain was one of the countries that they were looking at for immigration, especially because for its long tradition of tolerance. However, Britain did not make it easy for them because the country's immigration laws at the time did not distinguish between, did not make any distinction based basically on the circumstances of immigration. Often these refugees from Germany and later from other European countries only managed to get transit visas and were expected then from Britain to emigrate to other countries. The general feeling towards refugees was also, to a certain extent, influenced by a certain degree of anti-Semitism in the country in the 1930s, and the fear that these foreigners could compete for the same jobs in Britain. It's important to remember that the 1930s were a very difficult time, very difficult decade for Britain and Europe in general, with economic depression and high rates of unemployment. Many architects, therefore, amongst other professionals, decided to escape these oppressive political climates and relocate to other European countries. The Nazi government, as we know, not only disliked modern art, which they called degenerate, but also generally despised modern architecture, which had been flourishing in Germany and Central Europe in the 1920s. And this is obviously one of the most important manifestation of that in the Bauhaus in the South. Life for modernist architects became therefore very, very difficult, and for those who were both modernist and Jewish, things became really, really tricky, and therefore the migration started. A few well-known architects passed through Britain in the mid-1930s, staying for a few years and then moving on to the United States. The first of them was, the most prominent ones obviously, was Erich Mendelsohn, who emigrated to Britain in 1933, and Laszlo Molinari left Britain in the mid-1930s and then emigrated from Britain to the United States in 1937. And shortly afterwards, Miss van der Rohe joined them directly from Germany without passing through Britain. Obviously, we know that in 1933, under pressure from the Nazi government, the Bauhaus School had been closed. However, on the whole, there hadn't been a substantial immigration of architects until the later years of the decade. In 1939, first with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria to Germany in March, then with the annexation of the Sudetenland, which are the parts of the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, in October, and then finally with Kristallnacht in November, the night when there were attacks on Jewish people and Jewish establishments took place both in Germany and Austria, and many people were arrested and murdered. After these events, the number of would-be immigrants, obviously including architects, to Britain increased progressively. Therefore, in December, particularly on the 8th of December 1938, the ex-Prime Minister, Lord Baldwin, made a nationwide appeal in a BBC radio broadcast, which was also transmitted in the United States. And here we listen to an extract.
Week after week, a good cause is laid before you for this boys' club, for that village hospital, for the maimed and the halt and the blind and the deaf. Tonight, I have to speak for a world's good cause. I have to ask you to come to the aid of the victims, not of any catastrophe in the natural world, not of an earthquake, nor of a flood, nor of a famine, but of an explosion of man's inhumanity to men. Thousands of men, women, and children, despoiled of their goods, driven from their homes, are seeking asylum and sanctuary on our doorsteps, a hiding place from the wind and a covert from the tempest. I am no longer a minister of the Crown. I do not speak to you tonight as a politician or a member of a party. I am an ordinary Englishman who is shocked and distressed by the plight of these despised and rejected people and their innocent children. They may not be our fellow subjects, but they are our fellow men.
This was, of course, an appeal to help Jewish and other refugees fleeing persecution from Nazi Germany. As a result of this appeal, the so-called Lord Baldwin Fund for Refugees managed to raise over £500,000, which in 2022 was the equivalent of £36 million from over 1 million people. Some of this money was used for the well-known Kinder Transport scheme. Some was used instead to lease the Palace Hotel in Bloomsbury, which would become Bloomsbury House, the headquarters for many of the organizations that had been created in the countries to assist refugees, to give them financial support, to help them find an occupation. And these, you can see here, some of the most important of these committees. Of course, only the government could grant a resident permit. People who wanted to immigrate to Britain needed a guarantor, which means somebody who would ensure they would not become a financial burden for the government, or they needed to be self-supporting, either because they were already wealthy or because they had an offer of employment. Of course, very few of these emigres actually had the means to support themselves, even if they were wealthy in their own countries, because Germany restricted the amount of money that they could take from German banks before leaving the country. On the other hand, it was also not easy to find employment in a country going through a period, obviously, of great economic uncertainty. Also, at the end of 1938, looking at the architectural world, a group of students and staff from the Architectural Association in London established the Architects Czech Refugee Fund to support the architects from Central Europe who had made it to Britain, often obviously destitute, or speak on behalf of those who were trying to emigrate. You can see here an article published in the AA, the Architectural Association Journal, which is an appeal for assistance from other architects and from other students. I'll just read a small bit from it. It says here, the charities and humanitarian causes which appeal to us today are overwhelming. One cannot but respect the claim that charity begins at home, but the men of South Wales and Jarrow, desperate though their situation may be, are not faced with the immediate prospect of imprisonment. From Hamburg to Romania, social and ethical decency has collapsed. Is it putting it too high to remind ourselves that we are amongst the heirs of European civilization? Charity begins at home, and our home is Europe. So if you're giving elsewhere, please try to spare a little more of this for this urgent cause. Amongst the most tragic of the refugees are the lecturers, professors, and artists who have refused to prostitute their knowledge and brains to Nazi cultural edicts. Ethnology and history, for example, have ceased to exist as scientific studies, and architecture has been gravely interfered with. These persons of professional cultural standing must be rescued immediately. Many of them fled from Germany and Austria to Prague. Germany is now demanding that this should be handed over to the Gestapo. If we can prevent that, we shall, and you can help us. So, really determined group of people. And what is really extraordinary, as you will see, this is a letterhead. The organization became the Architects Refugee Relief Fund, is that they were really headed and the most active members of this group were really young architects. For example, Cecil Charles Handyside was only 30 years old. Max Locke was 29. You can see these names on the letterhead. Robert Jordan was in his early 30s, and Leo de Silas and Barbara Price were still students. There were obviously other individuals in the British architectural profession that had become concerned with the fate of so many of their European colleagues, but none, I believe, did more for them than Edward Carter, known as Bobby. Here we can see him in a photo of 1927, and 3 years later, when he was only 28, he became RIBA librarian and editor of the RIBA Journal. Carter has studied at the Architectural Association, was a committed modernist, and had many friends amongst practicing architects equally committed to modernism who could count on him as a real ally. Here we can see him in two much more informal photographs from the 1930s. On the left, he's with a couple, two architects, William and Eileen Tatton Brown. All his architect friends, basically. And on the right, we see him on the right of the photograph, and in the center, there's Godfrey Samuel, and on the left, Sir Chemaev, two very prominent architects of the time who were often corresponded with Carter with regards to architects trying to access the country or access the profession. Two examples here. On the left, there's a letter written by Godfrey Samuel to Carter in relation to an architect already in the country, Eric Herman, and on the right, a letter from Chemaev to Carter regarding architect Sigmund Katz, who was trying to leave to flee from Austria, but unfortunately eventually never managed to, and perished in the Holocaust. Carter had also many friends in the modern artist set. This is a photograph of a party at his house, and many of you might recognize in the foreground on the left Barbara Hepworth, and further in the background, looking towards the camera, there's her partner Ben Nicholson. Carter was also a strong advocate for RIBA's support of SIAM. As secretary of the RIBA Foreign Relations Committee, he cultivated a wide range of international relations and contributed really substantially at making the RIBA more widely known throughout the world. As a subsequent RIBA librarian put it, Carter was to be a one-man link between Portland Place and the great European figures, most of whom became his personal friends. For example, in 1937, he organized behind the scenes the farewell dinner for Walter Gropius. This is when Gropius left Britain for the United States. You can see in these slides on the left-hand side a letter to Carter from Laszlo Molinari, complimenting him and congratulating him on the success of the dinner, and expressing his appreciation of Carter as a friend. And on the right, you can see a letter that Walter Gropius wrote to Carter a few years later. This is 1943. Carter had been visiting Gropius in the States, and Gropius says, "We, both Isa and I, have enjoyed you staying with us greatly. You are such a master of the word, and you have all the virtues of the Englishman without his probable drawbacks. Wherever you have been here, you have left a strong impression." That's what I found also when I passed New York for a very short time. Also, a really interesting photograph I found in our collection. You can see this is the garden of the house at Bentleywood that Chemaev built for himself. Carter is sitting on a chair on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, sitting on the grass, is his wife Barbara, and then there's a few of his young architects' friends. But sitting in the middle, kind of sheltering his face from the sun, you might be able, hopefully, next to the child, to spot Frank Lloyd Wright. Carter was also very much a man of the left, and right in the heart of the British architectural establishment. He was a member of the politically active ATO, the Architects and Technicians Organization. You can see on the right one of the demonstrations related to the Spanish Civil War, so in favor of aiding the Spanish Republicans. Carter was also deeply concerned with the fate of architects in Germany and Central Europe. And here I found a really telling quote from architect Humphrey Carver, which says, "As men of intellect and talent were forced out of Germany and Central Europe in the 1930s, and as people moved from one continent to another in the post-war world, the Carters were a rallying point of warm affection and exuberant ideas." So many also felt, not just Carter, that the RIBA itself should become officially engaged with the issue of the refugees. The idea of establishing a refugee committee within the RIBA had already been considered for a while and discussed between Carter and Chemaev. It was formally set up by the RIBA Council in January 1939. You can read here the official aims of the committee. In essence, it was tasked to strike a very difficult balance between giving assistance to foreign architects who could no longer find work in their native countries and sometimes were actually in physical danger, and safeguarding job opportunities for local architects in a period of great economic recession. So Carter This is the list of the members of the committee. You can see Carter as secretary and Robert Jordan as honorary secretary. The two of them were particularly active within the committee. They started a statistical inquiry on the number of refugee architects already in the country. They consulted other professional bodies. They corresponded with other refugee committees and were generally really trying to take the pulse of the profession on this matter. The committee consolidated all the information that they gathered in the first months of 1939 in a report to the RIBA Council, in which they basically advocated for the RIBA to acquire a much more active role in the process of granting job permits, and they wanted for the RIBA to become a filter for the Home Office in this process. Up until that point, the Home Office had only sporadically consulted the RIBA on these cases. This report was sent to a number of organizations, especially all the refugee committees, as you can see. It was published in the RIBA Journal. It was shared with the architectural press. We can see a response from the Architects Journal and the Architect and Building News to the report. It was also shared with the press in general. The Times, for example, there are all these clippings, the Daily Telegraph, the Evening Standard, and so on, and shared also with other several organizations such as the British Council, the Victorian Albert Museum, and so on. The reception was generally extremely positive to this report. I'll just show you a few examples of the responses that it got from the various committees. Here, the Architects Refugee Relief Fund says, I think it's excellent in every way, and I've made no alterations. Robert Jordan says, the Coordinating Committee for Refugees, I should be grateful if it would be possible for you to let me have yet another copy of your excellent report on the work of the committee. The German Jewish Aid Committee says, I should like to express on behalf of this committee our deep appreciation for all that you're doing to assist these unfortunate people. And another on the Refugee Committee says, I'm very glad to hear the good news and would like to express my appreciation for the splendid response of the British architects to the refugee problem. And the Austrian Self-Aid says, with great pleasure, we have read your report on the refugee question. We've been delighted by the broad-mindedness and generosity expressed in this expose, and especially about the knowledge of facts. Very important. And finally, one of the refugee architects, Felix Gaugenfeld, we'll hear a bit more about him later, says, I was deeply impressed when reading the report of the Refugee Committee published in the RIBA Journal. I wish to convey my most sincere congratulations to the committee, and particularly to whoever might be individually responsible for the composition of this report, which I think is equally admirable as a document of human attitude and as a piece of writing. So very telling. The RIBA Council approved the recommendations of the report, but the committee only had 4 months to try and implement its plan of action because obviously, as we know, war was declared on the 3rd of September. In its very short lifespan, the committee dealt with at least 140 applicants, either through direct contact with them or brought to the committee's attention by one of the other refugee committees or by individual architects. We can see here one of the standard forms that they were using for every person. Applications obviously had increased after Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. By July, there was a rising number also of applications from Hungary. Some of these applicants were still in their home countries or were displaced in neighboring countries. Others were already in Britain. We can see here a form that was later used when some of these people were threatened with internments. All these people were trying to find a guarantor, to get a job permit, to get a job offer. And as we've seen, as we previously explained, this wasn't easy, and things were made even more difficult for them because their qualifications, even those obtained in the most prestigious school of architecture in architectural schools in Europe, were not recognized in Britain. In fact, the Architects Registration Board had established that anyone who could not prove they'd been practicing in Britain before July 1938 had to take a qualifying exam in the UK in order to register as an architect and therefore be able to practice. So in a letter sent on the 1st of December 1939 to an inquiry receipt, Carter says, quote, 9/10 of the British architectural profession is almost entirely unemployed. no foreign architect coming to England now stands any chance whatever to finding employment. So who were these applicants? You can see here a few examples of their letters and the photos they sent with them. Some of them are very well-known names. For others, we've already almost forgotten their names. Most of them, as you can imagine, were Jewish. At least as far as I know, at least half of them, a lot more. Not all of them were. This is an example for architect Otto Ernek, for example, from Czechoslovakia. And basically the summary of the situation is that this Catholic is not Jewish, is non-political, but he has been forbidden to practice because his work, presumably modern, did not meet with the approval of the Nazi Ministry of Culture. The Nazis had given orders to the Republic of Czechoslovakia that they're to forbid him to work in the country. It's really poignant, clearly, to go through all this material and to realize how much all the material they sent was incredibly important to them. They were sending CVs, they were sending testimonials, they were sending copies of their qualification, photographs of their work, sometimes even drawings. Particularly interesting, this architect, Robert Roth, decided to send a photo montage of his work for basically to encapsulate what he was about. We also find in the papers documents like this one, again, really telling. This is related to the Austrian architect Karl den Huber, and this document, which has the translation in English, as you can see from its basically a statement from the Imperial Court of Applied Art and Culture in Vienna, saying, in the examination of facts regarding your personal position, I have confirmed that you do not possess the necessary trustworthiness for the practice of the profession of architect. I therefore refuse your admission to this association. You're not entitled further to practice your profession of architect. Among the applicants, there were also a number of women, 12, including, for example, one architectural photographer, Helen Esselberger, one art editor, one math teacher, and one sculptor, Anna Mahler. And yes, it's interesting to notice that not all applicants were architects. There were around 20 who weren't. There were also engineers, builders, and so on. Anna Mahler, you probably know about her. She was the daughter of Gustav Mahler and stepdaughter of Walter Gropius, who was the second husband of her mother, Alma. By the time she decided to emigrate to London, she was already an established artist in Vienna. After the war, she then moved to California and then came back to Europe in the mid-1960s. So a number of women. There were also married couples, husband and wife, both architects. For example, Adolf and Leni Stahl, we can see here also an example of their work. Jacques and Jacqueline Groag, Hans and Eva Burek, Antonin and Carlotta Haytum, and Gustav and Gusti Feuer. Here is the letterhead and the photographs they sent of themselves and of their daughter. Many of them were modernist architects. Some were of more traditional school, as you have seen from the image, the previous image. And as you can expect, many tragic stories are revealed while studying the RIBA Refugee Committee papers. For example, architect Arthur Blitz, he was the chief architect between 1929 and 1939 for a very important firm in Prague, specialized in interior decoration and furniture. He had been supported by Serge Mayev in his attempt to emigrate into the country in the UK, but unfortunately didn't manage to, and was killed at Auschwitz. Another architect from Germany, Arthur Kohn, he was government architect. He was also a film set designer. And again, he couldn't get out in time and died in the ghetto at Riga. Even more tragic, for examples like this, Siegfried Friedlander, another German architect, he had been recommended, as you can see from this letter, by the Committee to Home Office for a labor permit. He had managed to get a residence permit. He was basically ready to move to the UK, and unfortunately, again, didn't make it in time and also perished in the Holocaust. Then there's other cases like Ferenc Domeny, a very established and successful Hungarian architect, recognized internationally. He'd been supported in his emigration by Godfrey Samuel, again recommended by the committee to the Home Office for a labour permit. He did manage to move to the UK, but after a few months he committed suicide. Then there was Eric Glöden, who, again, supported by Godfrey Samuel, he came to Britain, then he had to go back to Germany, preparing to move for his move to the country. But he, while not involved directly in the failed plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, he and his wife had sheltered General Fritz Lindemann, who was one of the plotters, and they were eventually betrayed to the Gestapo and tried and executed. Another kind of tragic side of the story is in 1940, a year after, the year after the breakout of the war, many of those who made to Britain, most of the German speakers, ended up in internment camps because there was a general fear that anyone with a German accent basically could be a spy, and often Jewish refugees could end up in the same camp and therefore living next to Nazi sympathizers. The story of, it's really fascinating, the story of the internment, but it's a story for another time. But some of them, for example, are interior designer Fritz Kleemann. You can see a letter he writes to Carter from Onkan camp in the Isle of Man. You can see the address, and also the fact that it was open, it was inspected, obviously. Luckily, many of the internees were released during the course of the war. In fact, many of them only after a few months. For example, Fritz Ruhmann, he again had a very established career in Germany. He had to flee first to Prague and then managed to make it to London with his family to join his brother Helmut Ruhmann, who was a very prominent and important restorer at the National Gallery. Ruhmann worked with British architect Michael Dugdale. You can see here an example of their work, but in spite of that was interned on the Isle of Man later in that year in 1939, and even when he was released, he never managed to get the same work opportunities in the UK than he had in Germany. A similar case is that of the Czech architects, the Czech architect Jacques Groag, and you can see with his wife Jacqueline. Groag trained as an architect in Vienna and then joined Adolf Loh's office. He set up his own practice in 1926. It became one of the leading architects in Vienna, working on housing projects, public buildings, private houses, and so on. But in Britain, he basically designed exhibitions, interior schemes, furniture designs. You can see some examples in this on this slide, and being unable to devote himself to architecture for the rest of his life, he experienced depression. His wife, Hilda Pick, instead, who you can see in the photographs, who later changed her name to Jacqueline Groag, she was more fortunate. She was already a renowned textile designer. She had produced and designed fabrics for leading Parisian fashion houses such as Chanel, Schiaparelli, Paul Poiret, and so on. And after moving to Britain, she managed to continue with a very successful career, and her work was extremely influential, actually, on mid-century textile design. We can see one of her patterns on the curtain in the photograph on the left. Another success story is that of Eugene Rosenberg, the later Eugene Rosenberg. He had a very successful practice in Prague. Again, you can see an example of his work here. He moved to the UK, but then he was deported and interned in Australia for 2 years. However, undeterred, he came back to the UK, and he managed to fund with architect Cyril Mardell and FRS York. You can see them all in the photograph here. The practice York, Rosenberg, Mardell, YRM, which became one of the most important, most prominent and prolific architectural partnerships of post-war Britain. And here we can see one of the most famous projects, the US Embassy in London. Another example is Peter Moro. He arrived in Britain to finish his studies. This is one of the projects that he designed in collaboration with Richard Llewellyn Davis. However, again, he was interned on the Isle of Man, being German, but when he was, after being released, he continued with his profession. He established a successful practice in London and ended up working on a very important project, the Royal Festival Hall in London. And again, you can see him in the photograph here on the left-hand side of the photograph with the other architects of the Royal Festival Hall. Other interesting success stories are these, for example, the Hungarian architect Louis Erdi. He managed somehow to move to Britain during the war, which is quite extraordinary. He established his own practice in 1947 in London and designed many, especially motels and hotels and other projects which were widely published in the architectural press. Another Hungarian architect, Stefan Buzas, he finished his studies at the Architectural Association in London, also contributed to the Festival of Britain, as you can see from this drawing, and later went in partnership with a British architect, Alan Irvine. Particularly, I found particularly interesting and moving this story. This is a letter, the letter in blue, that a young a man, 17-year-old, a boy really, Franz Tischler, wrote to the RIBA. He had managed with his mother to emigrate to Britain. His father was the famous artist and architect Heinrich Tischler, who had been imprisoned and died in a concentration camp. So Tischler writes to the RIBA asking them to help him find a job in an architect's office, just to to help. And the reply is really quite obviously hopeless. They tell him not to hope too much because it's incredibly difficult. It says to find a kind of work experience or internship in the profession at the moment. But then I managed to later find in the RIBA library an article, as you can see, of showrooms designed by F. Tischler. This is him, Franz Tischler, who not only managed to find obviously a placement, but he managed to study architecture and become an architect and have a career in this field. Apart from those who came to Britain, obviously other architects emigrated much further afield. We have the husband and wife, Naum and Eva Burich. They fled first to Holland from Germany and then to London, and from London to Australia. Despite their degrees at the Technical Schule in Berlin, elite European university, they found that their qualifications were not recognized, and so therefore they were unable to gain registration as architects. Hugh managed to establish a practice as practice planning consultant and designer. He designed some outstanding houses like the one you can see here, but only managed to gain registration as architect in the 1970s, while his wife, Eva, ended up giving up on her career as an architect and became an editor and writer for architectural publications. Another really interesting case is that of Gertrude Louise Goldschmidt. She studied architecture in Stuttgart, moved to the UK in 1939, and from here she emigrated to Venezuela, where she gradually abandoned architecture and became a sculptor, a very renowned sculptor and visual artist with the name of Gego. Many other architects obviously moved to the United States. For example, Hans Weiss, he had studied under Adolf Loos. He founded the practice Weiss and Wotitz in Vienna. This is one of their works. He was helped by the Architects Refugee Committee to move to UK, and eventually went to the States, where he became a prominent interior designer in New York. Rudolf Baumfeld had a very established career in Austria in partnership with Norbert Schlesinger. You can see here one of his houses, or the houses they designed. He again first fled to Czechoslovakia, then Italy. Here he was imprisoned, arrested, and then managed to escape and reached New York. From 1943, he was employed in the office of Victor Gruen in Los Angeles. Gruen was also a European émigré, and later became a partner in the firm. And Baumfeld's papers for information are at UCLA. Antonin Haytham is another interesting example. He was an architect, artist, set designer, teacher. He was a part of the avant-garde group, the Vietzel in Prague. He designed also buildings, residential buildings, theater sets, and is particularly well known for the Czech Pavilion at the Brussels World Fair of 1935. He was supported by important architects in Britain, recommended by the committee, Refugee Committee, to the Home Office, again for labour permit. And while he was waiting to move to the UK, he went to the United States with his wife, Carlotta. You can see a portrait by Man Ray here on the slide. They went to the States to work on the installation of the Czech Pavilion at the New York World Fair and to design the Czech section of the Golden Gate Fair in San Francisco. You can see here in the slide. But after the outbreak of the war, Haythams decided, understandably, to stay in America, where in 1941, Antonin founded the Department of Industrial Design of at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. And again, the archive of the items is at the Smithsonian. Liane Zimbler, a woman architect. These are two slides that you will see that I have stolen from the excellent presentation by Dr. Caroline Wohlgemuth, who's done a lot of research on her. She was possibly the first woman in Europe to be awarded an architect's license, certainly the first in Austria. She was very successful in her own country. She opened offices in Vienna and Prague. Her work ranged from banks, offices, shops, homes, furniture, and so on. But in 1938, like many others, he had to leave Europe and moved with her family to Los Angeles, where she began to pursue a career in furniture design. She soon headed her own design firm and did a lot of lecturing, wrote articles, and took part in shows and exhibitions. You can see here towards the end of her career, she actually practiced well into her 70s, and she was member of the American Institute of Interior Designers, as well as the Association of Women in Architecture. Her papers are in the special collections and university archives at Virginia Tech. And finally, Felix Augenfeld, I mentioned him before, had the great privilege and pleasure of consulting his archive at Columbia University at the Avery Drawings and Archives back in May. And I took a few snapshots there. He had a very successful practice in Vienna together with Karl Hofmann. In addition to their architectural projects, they also design interiors, textiles, and furniture. You can see here one of the design for one of the fairs in Germany. In 1938, Augenfeld, who was Jewish, decided to leave Vienna for London, and then a year later he moved to New York. We can see here his license to practice architecture in the state of New York. Most of his work in the United States consisted in interior design, in furniture, but he also there was some really interesting architectural projects documented in the archive. For example, the beach house he designed for himself on Fire Island, which is an island not far from New York City. You can see here one of the drawings for the beach house, and this is a photograph from our own collection of the house. One of his clients in New York was a mural Morris gardener, Buttinger, who was from Chicago but had lived in Vienna before World War II, and played a very important role in assisting Augenfeld to leave first to London and then to New York. Their friendship lasted for the rest of their lives, and Augenfeld ended up designing the Buttinger's New York City Residence and Research Library, which is, I've seen photographs and drawings in the archive, and it looks absolutely wonderful project. This is one of the drawings, and here you can see one of the photographs. This building is by the way, is now a locally designated landmark. So to conclude, there is still, I think, a lot to do to understand the full extent of the impact that the RIBA Refugee Committee's decisions and the extent of this impact, and then to assess whether the RIBA could have done more in the circumstances, which I think retrospectively always feels the case. But in spite of that, I have no doubt on the significance of their work as one of the very few professional bodies who actively tried to tackle the refugee crisis of the late 1930s. And my research into the RIBA archives has also shown me that the personal efforts of Bobby Carter, of Robert Jordan, and some of their colleagues really made a substantial difference to the lives of many refugee architects. And I'll just give you really a short example. Sorry, these are two more photographs, two portraits of Augenfeld. We can see an extract from a letter from German architect Friedrich Neumann, written to the RIBA after the war from Bremen, where he says, "I therefore wish to thank the Royal Institute in writing. The Institute was instrumental in helping me to get my entry permit to England and successfully applied for my working permit at the Home Office. Again, it was the Royal Institute which was helpful in getting my release from internment, thus enabling me to work for Waterhouse and Ripley from 1941 to 45. And finally, I have to thank for being allowed to use the library of the Royal Institute. All this the Institute did for an alien who came to your country as a refugee, and their kindness I shall never forget." So, not forgetting, memory is very important. We have to keep talking about these events, these topics, even more so because there are not many left from the generation of the refugees' children. And because we don't want to forget, we want to keep learning about these architects. We, here at the RIBA, we're working on an online database of all the individuals who were mentioned in the papers, which will be hopefully launched within the next 2 or 3 months. This is a very, preview of the current draft of the database, but watch this space. And thank you.
I'm going to join now. I wish we would have even more time for this ongoing research. It's a complete, I think, revelation for many, and the website will be as well. Maybe I'm going to start in a minute by asking you about that. I think so many of us know so much about the famous people you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk who came through Britain as a way station. Never totally clear whether Gropius, Breuer, Maholi thought of England as a way station or whether they began to think of moving on once they were there. But you've revealed a whole nother dimension as well. So I think everyone who's listening, you're probably going to get inundated with emails now from people. So maybe actually I'll start by just inviting you to have a few more minutes to tell us more about what form the database would take, and really how would you push this amazing research that you've done from within the archives of the RIBA forward. One thing that occurred to me in each of the incredible cases that you gave us is how obviously this database could almost be cross-indexed with countless other databases to really begin to fill out a whole picture, and how much one would love to even be able to make a kind of network map of Europe,
Yes.
Britain, and the world to see the movements of these people. So anyway, any further reflections you could give us on the future of this project? And I suppose once the database is online, is that something that you will continue to work on internally, or are there plans to network to have other
Yes.
researchers further populate, so to speak, and enrich this database?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, well, first of all, I wanted to say, I know that there's some people probably online now who were at that conference or were aware of the conference, but the first output, so to speak, of the research was this conference that I organized last year at the RIBA, called Displaced Lives, which was already a first, like incredible coming together of people from Europe, from Britain, from the United States, and kind of exchange of experiences, information, research, and it was extraordinary. I found it, and it helped kind of nurture or grow the network that already started developing in the last few years, because I've been working on this for quite a few years now. As you can imagine, Barry and everyone, you know, when you start researching a topic like this, it's kind of, it continues to expand in every direction, and you could lose yourself and follow, you know, like follow so many different line of inquiries and never end up. I have what we call a day job as well as photo curator. So, but yeah, to answer your question more properly, the database, yeah, at the moment it's going to work as I was showing very quickly. So it's quite simple for the time being, but hopefully quite thorough as well. The idea is to you know, we're going to present you know, a list of names in alphabetical order of every applicant, whether architects or not. Anyone who is mentioned in the Refugee Committee papers. And then obviously you can click on every, you know, on every name and go into the records, which will include a biography, you know, not too long, obviously, but a biography, and then bibliographical references that I found, references to anything we have in the RIBA collections. There's going to be references or links to what we already have digitized. So really trying to gather everything that the research has revealed for each one of these individuals. I have to mention at this point, very important contributor to the project is Dr. Irina Murray, who's been working really for a while on the Czech and the Slovak architects and you know, and other individuals. So she's going to be a major contributor of the database as well. Yes, so the idea is to on the main page, basically, when you know, you can browse the names, there's going to be people will be able to search by nationality, by country of migration, by places of study. You know, it's really important. We kind of try to establish where everybody has studied. Also, exactly as you said, to try and start figuring out the connections. And there's obviously infinite connections amongst these architects and other architects. And so on. So the idea is obviously for the database to become a research hub that anyone can access from anywhere in the world, and also anyone can contribute to, in the sense that unfortunately we can't be fully interactive as such. But I want it to be interactive in the sense that I'm going to, you know, basically ask for anyone who can contribute their knowledge or their research, or you know, want to add or improve what information we have found and that we publish on the database. We want to make it obviously better and better. It's like, you know, it just in a way it's a starting point, so to speak. But and as you said, also, it was interesting, you were talking about cross-references with other databases. Absolutely. I mean, I've been talking for a while with the Ben-Uri Gallery here in London. They created a very similar database already a few years ago on artists who emigrated to Britain. I suppose this one is a bit different because it's not just about the ones who moved to Britain, but about every single individual, whatever their fate, you know, who was somehow in touch with the RIBA. So the RIBA becomes kind of the focus. And then the idea is also hopefully to continue the research and hopefully get to the point of being able to do an exhibition or a publication, or as Irina says, a motion pitch. I think that's
well, yes, I can't help thinking of the recent movie on the Czech children in the Kindertransport called One Life, which is a deeply moving
I've seen
film, but I think is obviously, you mentioned it at the very beginning, is obviously connected to this. We're going to go back a little bit and talk, even though I know you want to move us on to a lesser known chapter, about those earlier what could we call them? More voluntary émigrés who leave before this committee exists, and who leave really before Hitler's military operations begin just because of the oppressions and the kind of obviousness of the ominous ominous development of events. So I'm thinking in cases of Gropius and Breuer, who I know best, that unless I'm wrong, they needed to be associated with a British architect. I don't know at the moment of arrival or simply to be able to practice. And it was fascinating to think of F.R.S. York's life as being one that has many episodes of involvement with refugees. But I wonder, is that still the case for this much larger group who the committee is receiving applications for? Do they need to be paired up with a professional partner, almost the way that a child in the Kindertransport needs parents?
It doesn't look like it, because while some certainly went into partnership with British architects, others managed to basically establish their own practice and to actually employ other architects. I suspect, well, in fact, I think I found out that obviously when these architects did manage to get here, and they were obviously privileged if they were able to employ other architects, local architects, which, as I said, it wasn't easy for them to do it at all. But no, yes, that's interesting, because of course when in the mid-30s it was definitely the case that they needed to go in partnership with a British architect, and which is obviously what Breuer did, what Gropius did. But yeah, no, it doesn't seem the case anymore in the late 30s. There were other restrictions and other obstacles, and but not necessarily this one. Even if, as I've showed, a few of them did work in partnership with British architects. I suppose there was also an easy way into the profession for them, because working with somebody who was already knowledgeable of the rules and regulations and all the quirks as well of the profession in this country was really beneficial to them, rather than having to start from relatively little knowledge. So
your research is already so amazing that I feel it's almost churlish to ask you, what could you know if you went further? And this is an ongoing project outside your day life, your day job. I'm wondering, I think in earlier conversations you mentioned an interest in, and you didn't have time to talk about it here, but how do you assess the various opinions in the world of architecture about this? What were the reactions to the committee? Are there, the British are great writers to the press, and are there letters to the press? Is there a ruckus about this? Are there voices that speak against it, or would they self-censor because it would seem to be inhumane to be opposed to this?
I haven't, obviously, I mean, it would be interesting to go through all the papers of the time, systematically. I haven't in everything I've found in the archives, I haven't found examples of such letters in the general press. However, I have found something that Carter and the committee, they were keeping all this material, obviously, because it was of interest. There was this this organization called the IIAS, which was basically the Incorporated Association of Architects and Surveyors. They had their own magazine called The Parthenon, and they basically published like an open letter on it, objecting to the arrival of refugee of architects from Central Europe, because they, the usual argument, Barry, they would take our jobs, competitors to a job. In fact, the usual arguments that you hear over and over again, the fact that they would probably accept, like a lower salary than we do because they're desperate. So, they're obviously really dangerous competitors. And in fact, they even kind of, they doubted that some of these émigrés were real refugees. So again, haven't you heard that before? So it's really interesting. The arguments are always the same. So there was definitely a part of the profession that was not happy. At the same time, as we've seen, there were lots, especially they say that in the committee, especially the younger members of the profession, or instead very active and very instead in favor of supporting the architects. I think there must have been a lot in the press with regards to refugees in general, because I did find some really interesting snippets and little articles that again that the committee kept for reference. So there was definitely a debate going on, and as a consequence of that, I suppose there was this society was formed just specifically to change public opinion on refugees, and it's a really interesting one because they the chairman of the society was this liberal politician, Andrew McFadden, who not only helped a lot of these of especially Jewish people who were trying to immigrate, but also helped them being released from internment from the camps, and also it was an early advocate of the European Union. So I found him really interesting person. And then there was the most active person in the society, Aline McKinnon, was also a Liberal Party politician, and she was a supporter of women's rights. So there's some really interesting people that you come across when you do this research. So there was definitely, I think, quite a debate in public opinions about refugees in general. As I said, there was certainly quite a bit of anti-Semitism in the country, but there was, luckily, I think there were like both parts were kind of balancing each other, and in fact, what happened with the internees is that in spite of this is something that I think British people maybe can be proud of, in spite of the fact that they were being bombed and the war was raging and so on. There was an outrage basically about the fact that that refugees were interned, and it was apparently the push of public opinion that got them released often only within a few months. Because there was a complete change of, in general, public opinion shifted, and it seems so outrageous to put these people in internment camps that the government.
If you were to pin down that beginning of that public reaction, when would you say that is? In 41 or?
Yeah, exactly. Which is also, like a really difficult period for Britain during the war. That's why I think it's, as other people have remarked, it's quite extraordinary that happened. And in spite of being, the fear of invasion, obviously, the Blitz and everything that happened, actually being able to see with clarity what we're doing is not right, and it's not. It's something that we can't accept, and that apparently was really crucial in starting with people being released from camps.
Are there multiple camps, or was it primarily on the Isle of Man?
It was, I think there was one or two other places, but the Isle of Man, was the one that everybody always refers to, where there was more than one camp. They were divided as well. There were women and men in separate camps, and obviously there's these terrible stories that you hear of, of these people, again, Jewish refugees, going and boarding the boats to get to the islands and being, insulted by the villagers, and and being, obviously just they were German, just the fact that they spoke German branded them basically. But at the same time, that's what I was saying. It's not an area that I've done a lot of research on. Others have, but it's absolutely fascinating what happened there in those camps, because there were often so many, like important cultural figures from all over Europe, and so they created all these activities. They were musicians, they played concerts, they gave lectures, they learned from each other, they almost created like a sort of university. It was, I read somewhere recently, that they were, camp in the Isle of Man was one of the most, the places of culture basically in Britain, one of the centers of culture, because there were so many of these incredible people all together.
It's interesting that while you were doing the case studies, and before you finally said, some of the men were sent on to camps, including to the one that we know about on the Isle of Man, I was thinking that I first learned about this through the publication of the diaries of Harry Seidler, had not come to Britain as an architect because he was too young. He went on to be an incredibly important modernist architect in Australia, but he had come as a teenager to Britain. I think his brother was here first, or there first. I'm not in Britain right now. And Seidler came at about 16, and then he took some architectural courses at a technical school in Cambridgeshire, and then gets sent to the Isle of Man. But the interesting thing about him is that we know that many of the interrees on the Isle of Man were then transported to Canada. So then he ended up in a camp in Manitoba, I think. So one doesn't really think of the Commonwealth as also suddenly becoming a kind of commonwealth of internment camps. So I wonder.
Australia on one end, yeah. Australia at one end and Canada at the other end. Yeah.
So there are people who were brought over by this refugee committee who then end up being transported out of Britain to other places of detainment. Do you know that? Whether
Yeah,
that's
as I said, Rosenberg definitely did. He not only ended up in Australia, but he ended up staying there for 2 years, which is longer than a lot of the refugees who were in internment camps in Britain. That's why I found it incredible. After that experience, he didn't give up, and he went back to Britain and good, and he had a great career in Britain. But yeah, he could have been forgiven to give up on Britain and stay in Australia afterwards, like others did.
So back to this transition from the voluntary, let's call them, maybe we should make a distinction, I think you did in one conversation we had, between émigrés and refugees. So if we think of Breuer, who actually was Jewish, Gropius not, but they're émigrés to Britain. They choose to come. And in fact, they have moved on by the time this refugee committee is set up. Is there any connection between the émigrés and the refugee committee? Or are these really two completely distinct chapters?
Yeah. I mean, the definitely Gropius definitely emerges, every now and then appears because as I showed, he stayed in touch certainly with Carter and with some of the others, architects in London. So there was this. Yeah, there still was this correspondence with them. For example, as I was saying, with Anna Mahler, there was certainly, obviously, I can't remember whether there's the specific letter, but there's definitely a connection there that she might have ended up applying to the RIBA Refugee Committee in spite of not being an architect because of Gropius, I imagine. Because of a stepfather. There was also another example of a very young architect who was already working. He was working with Godfrey Samuel. So he was already working in an architect's office in Britain. But then, yeah, he was German again, so he was at risk of internment. But he was that again, Gropius tried to support him from the States. There's also Otti Berger, the textile designer from Bauhaus. Again, this is not in the Refugee Committee papers. This is in the Godfrey Samuel papers. He was incredibly active, so they really almost complement each other. The Refugee Committee papers and the Godfrey Samuel papers on the refugees. And she was in correspondence with Godfrey Samuel, and Gropius kind of gave him, wrote to support her again, her application, her attempt to be supported by Samuel, even if, as we know, unfortunately she didn't make it. She didn't make it back to Britain.
No, she died. I think she died in a camp in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, that's right. And there's also another young architect called, I think it was Paul Levi, who actually became a sculptor later. And there's extensive correspondence between Godfrey Samuel and Gropius, because he was trying to get him to go to the States and to study there at Harvard. So yeah, there's a lot of correspondence between the two. So there's certainly involvement. I think more because of he stayed in touch and in quite close contact with all these people. So especially if they were thinking of America, you know, and a lot of these people had intended to go to America. I think when if they could, they maybe called on him because he was a good contact to have there. So he definitely appears in this narrative. Not Breuer, but Gropius certainly. Also because I think he had a quite important position at Harvard. So
yeah, that raises any number of questions, but two in particular. How many of these applications to be able to come as a refugee were accompanied by letters of support? Was that something that was expected, the way one would apply for a fellowship today, or even, or is that simply something that some people were able to obtain as a supplement to their appeal?
Yeah, I don't think they were expected as such. What you find is that either in terms of support, it's normally happened, for example, that one of these architects got in touch with one of the British architects, and then this architect got in touch with the committee. So, and I mentioned, for example, Chermayev, Godfrey Samuel, they were the ones that often, that were quite active in that sense. But what they did send, which was interesting, rather than recommendations from people and from, say, architects or professionals in their own countries, they sent they often or not rarely had letters saying, this person worked with me. So testimonies basically of what they have achieved, either their qualification, their academic qualifications, or letters saying this person has worked for me in this period and excelled in their work, and yeah, so they had that type of recommendations, definitely. And maybe not always, I imagine, from firms or practices or individuals that were necessarily well known in Britain, but it was still obviously something that they felt that if they could provide that, as well as, the fact that they sent their CV and they had sent, when possible, they sent examples of their work, which is obviously another incredibly fascinating part of the papers. Clearly, the visual material.
Yeah.
Sometimes they send magazines as well to say, look, I've been published.
Yeah. So I mean, clearly with that body of material, there is also a visual archive that would make for absolutely fascinating exhibition. And I know in some of the exhibitions that I've done over the years, you put on the exhibition and you think, I want this to be a place to present to the public the fullness of the research that we've done in preparation for this exhibition. And then at the opening, 6 or 7 people come up to you and say, oh, why didn't you get in touch with me? Because I have this and I have that, and I can bring you this and that. And the first time it happens, you're deeply embarrassed. And then you realize that an exhibition is actually a catalyst for bringing out materials that are in private hands that supplement the story. So I can really imagine that a future exhibition would add further to the materials, and
definitely,
even if it's
you're
just people saying, I remember my grandfather used to tell us that, and oral things as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because I think every stage of this research or this project is, as you said, is a catalyst. It's never like the end point. It's always an opportunity to expand, to learn more. It's also, having given quite a few talks and done the conference and so on, every now and then I get contacted by someone. I mean, and that's great. I mean, just recently, one of the descendants of one of the architects, Georg Lesser, later George Lesser, who moved to Britain, contacted me from the United States, saying, I saw that you organized this conference. This was my grandfather, and then they send me photographs of him, which I never seen before. So yeah, I wish that happened all the time. But it hasn't happened a lot. But it has happened that people have reading about these things, or as you said, it will hopefully happen in the exhibition. You start stirring and and contacts emerge, and especially finding the descendants is always like it's always really thrilling, and I don't know whether that's the right word, but it's, you know, it's great when you can find that. I mean, there's something that I didn't have time to talk about, obviously, because it was already a long talk, but is when I show the letterhead and the photograph of Gustav and Gutsi Foyer, those two, well, he was Hungarian, she was Czech, actually, and there's a photo of their daughter next to them. One of the most, I think, exciting and moving moments of this research is when, through friends in Budapest who are both work at the Architectural Museum there, they managed to get in touch with Hilda, the daughter, who was the little girl in the photograph, and I went to see them. I went to see her 2 years ago. She still has this incredible archive of the work of their parents, which we had no idea I was still there. They have all the furniture they designed, they have drawings, they have photographs. So yes, it's
yeah. Well, in that way, that it's not, in fact, only a British story. It is an international story, and the work. I know the team at the wonderful team at the Hungarian Museum of Architecture, but it's clearly let's say in the post-communist societies of the Czech Republic. I don't know, you didn't seem to have any Slovakian architects there, but quite a number of Hungarians, because of course Hungary was one of the most prosperous industrialized countries of Europe, along with Bohemia and Moravia. But for these countries today to recover the history of modernism in those countries, it inevitably intersects with recovering the memory and the contributions of the émigrés, and those who were forced to leave and those who chose to leave. So there's an enormous interest in recuperating people from that pattern of leaving from the country. So this is. So that I guess leads me to the question, just personally. You said this is not really part of your day job, so this was not your assignment at the RIBA. Can you maybe reflect on how this project came into being, how you got involved in it, what launched you? What is the biography of this project?
Yeah, well, the biography was that many years ago, when I was still assistant curator, I was asked to basically go through the RIBA Refugee Committee papers, because all the photographs basically at the RIBA, as you know, we have and hopefully people who are listening to this know, we have a fantastic very photographic collection, and we have wonderful collection drawings and so on, and archives, but we have progressively extracted the photographs from the archives, so they can be kept at the right environmental conditions, even if like from the point of view of the one would like to keep all together, but what I did, sorry, I'm just losing myself on a site, but so I went through the papers to extract the photographs, which I then replaced with scanned on archival paper, so that people could go through the paper, can still see what photographs were included. And by doing that sparked it all, because it was this world open. Not that I didn't know that those things happened, or that but there's something. I am, as I said, I'm a photograph curator, but I have a huge history interest in architectural history, and that period is always. For some reason, always found it's interwar period, which is probably the period I'm most fascinated with. But that narrative, that story was just so incredible and felt so rich, and so just really waiting to be explored, because there had been a great exhibition just before I moved to London and catalogued, called Another World, curated by Charlotte Benton. The catalogue was a great starting source for my research, obviously. I was just the year before I moved to London, so I missed it. But so there was obviously important work had been done there, but obviously she was dealing with the architects who did move to Britain, and not only the ones obviously really who were in the papers. So yeah, I just thought this is incredible archive that hasn't possibly been explored yet, or not enough. I'm sure that researchers have gone through it, but as one topic. And so I left it to one side for a few years, and then a few years ago, I decided I need, to go back to it. I thought it's time to start, looking at it and going through the papers and just trying to understand what happened and yeah, and then as I was saying before, and as we all know, you start and then you especially with a subject like that, you can't stop. And then I started, obviously, the more research I did in the library, in the collections, and I started contacting people in elsewhere, other institutions in this country, in other countries. Again, Dr. Irina Marie was immediately on board because she then told me that when she was still at the RIBA, she was looking at that material and thinking, I need to do something with this. So yeah, it all came together, and and it kind of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, unlike, say, Reina and other people, I don't have a direct connection in terms of, my personal history to the topic. But I think it's incredible, just incredibly rich, incredibly full of everything. I don't know.
Well,
It's, as I said, as an amateur historian of architecture, I think it's a fantastic archive we have, and it's definitely so worth exploring. Also, and I see Ted, so I think I need to finish here. But also, clearly, I don't need to say this, and there's so many parallels to
today.
our lives and our world. So even more.
That was what I was going to ask you, if we had more time. I mean, of course, wars that are going on right now means that this is not simply a historical chapter that's absolutely fascinating, but I know even in our Columbia's Institute in Paris, we have displaced journalists, artists, not architects for the moment, from Ukraine. And so refugees and careers that are suddenly completely imperiled, if not ended, is a very contemporary topic. But I do see Ted is here to wisely remind us that some people want to move on either to lunch or to dinner or wherever they are, because one of the advantages of these webinars is that people can join us from many, many different places, as dispersed as the geographies of emigration that you were talking about. I'm going to follow this project with great interest, and it's absolutely fascinating. I wish we had, or maybe we need to revisit this as your research evolves. So thank you.
Definitely revisit, because frankly, it's a fascinating topic. And I just personally want to thank both of you for a wonderful program. I learned a great deal, and just a very interesting topic that really has not had a light shown on it to the extent that we've heard today. So thank you. Curry Seidler was one of my professors at the GSD, actually, and a fascinating man. Before we break, I wanted to share some details of the upcoming lecture series. The spring series will focus on the emergence of brutalism as a significant architectural movement following the Second World War. The series will include brutalist architecture's antecedents and influences, both architectural and social. It's spread throughout Europe and the UK. Its adoption internationally, and an examination of the reasons for its continuing impact and relevance, including the ongoing reassessment of many projects built during the 1960s and 70s. As in previous years, the lecture will be comprised of 4 monthly lectures, beginning in late January 2026. Hugh Pearman, former architecture and design critic of the Sunday Times and editor of the RIBA Journal, current chair of the 20th Century Society, and a member of the Trust Advisory Council of the British Architectural Library Trust, will serve as the interlocutor for the programs. Information on the British Architectural Library Trust, its activities and programs, and other upcoming lectures and events can be found on our website, thebaltrust.org. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to reconvening at a future time. Thank you.